Welcome to the Digital Insight Podcast, where today I'm asking, is access to fast and reliable supplier information more important now than perhaps ever before? Answering this question for us today is Stephany Lapierre, CEO of Tealbook, and Jim Bureau, CEO of JAGGAER.
I'm Stephany Lapierre. I'm the founder and CEO at Tealbook. At Tealbook, we aggregate an enormous amount of data across hundreds of millions of data source so that we create what we call a dynamic universal supplier profile for every B2B company in the world. What that means is that typically information about companies, suppliers specifically, that's collected through portals or manually or through services, we can do this much faster and at scale across millions of companies worldwide.
Jim Bureau, the CEO of JAGGAER. JAGGAER is a global company that provides our customers and partners the most intelligent, transparent, and frictionless secure commerce platform in the world. And we've been doing that for about 25 years now, celebrating our 25th year anniversary.
Sure. I think if you ask anyone if data is important, everyone in procurement would say absolutely. If you ask anyone how they feel about their data, they usually laugh or smile, mostly because data has been really difficult to harness. Data lives across systems, across people. And the only real way that our customers could synchronize data in the past have been through pretty heavy infrastructure around integration, services, people, and a very high dependency on suppliers to come to portals. And typically that results in multiple portals because the enterprise has more than one system. And so, the lack of opportunity to have a unified view of all the suppliers that you do business with really prevents from being able to capture the type of information that you need on the suppliers that you already have under contract and be able to leverage them more effectively, let alone be able to find suppliers also in the world that could ensure business continuity or shift production or increase competitiveness and meet other requirements. I think we've heard before, before COVID, you had this shift around, I'm buying systems, I want to be more intelligent. Data externally, data internally is quite difficult to have governance and have high quality and trust, knowing it's foundational. But what we've seen with COVID is the urgency in having that kind of visibility, able to tap into your existing supplier base at the speed that the organization needs it, to leverage those existing relationships at a deeper level beyond just spend, but really fully optimize, as well as be able to know in the market really quickly suppliers that are able to help you achieve, whatever goals may be. And there's a lot of examples. I think we'll talk about COVID specifically, but well beyond COVID, there's a real need for diversification, for reshoring, for innovation, for competitiveness, and the list goes on. And so if you don't have access in real time, fast enough to trusted information, it's much harder to be able to really impact and drive the value to the procurement function and to the organization.
Yeah, so your original question was why now, as opposed to previously. I would say this is it's always been an issue. It's not that it ever hasn't been an issue. And I think that there are two material dynamics that I think happened this year that have raised the level of awareness. Clearly, one was COVID, right, which requires a set of nimbleness and insight and transparency to suppliers across the globe in terms of, supply and certifications and quality. People were needing healthcare products, but then come to find out the quality wasn't there on some of them. And so how do you address that proactively? Combine that with the Black Lives Matter movement that has also occurred this year has just compounded, I think, that the sense of awareness. So I would say the two of those together have raised it a sense of urgency to actually do something about it, and created a real initiatives. It's interesting if you look at this topic from the B2B community right now, it's within the top 3 of everything that people want to address.
And we'll sort of dive a little deeper into, like you said, sort of those kind of big things that have happened in the last sort of 12 months that have really kind of changed and impacted the conversation. But sticking with kind of just broadly speaking, not just why now, but also how does then the two companies align? So obviously you've entered into this new partnership, but where did obviously there's a lot of synergies between what you both want to achieve and what you both can deliver and what you both do. But give me a little bit as to what sort of, how does you sort of share values, share understandings so that this relationship will really make such a great impact in terms of providing the supplier data, providing that kind of change that people need?
So, I would say this, Jagger and organizations like Jagger have been doing this for a long time, right? Our customer is incumbent upon us to collect supplier information to allow them to do the things that they do in terms of processing and establishing those relationships, setting contractual obligations and that type of thing. The challenge is if you are a supplier, Jagger is one of many. And so, I think that the challenge for the industry as a whole is how do I streamline that process so that I can do it once, and extrapolate it all over the place. And something that Jagger has evolved on quite a bit over the course of the last 18 months is how do we take advantage of the network of data that's out there and available, and for that matter can be automatically acquired and automatically updated in real time so that we don't put the onus on the suppliers to repeat the process over and over and over again, which is one of the reasons why, our relationship with Tealbook, right? And so, and I'll let Stephany elaborate, but they've got some unique capabilities that allow us as a vendor to be able to not put the onus on our suppliers, so that they can in fact have a more frictionless process to interact with their buyer community.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, we've admired what Jagger has built, and Jim and I had the chance to connect before we formalized a partnership, and there's definitely aligned values. And to Jim's point, the benefit of Tealbook is you don't actually need the supplier to come to the profile to be able to deliver better data, more complete, more insightful, more trusted data to the buy side. And so we can turn the light onto the vendor master at the speed and scale and maintain that data proactively across 100% of the suppliers, which is something that hasn't really been done at scale. And because we are technology agnostic, the suppliers can come to Tealbook. There's no fees to it, and it shouldn't matter if they go to Jagger, the portal of the client, or if they come to Tealbook to have that data synchronized. Now, the value that we have as an example is we're able to cross-certificate that it's small diversity, sustainability, GDPR, SOC 2. So we proactively grab this data. If a supplier wants to come and validate it, it should be validated in Tealbook or Jagger, and that data should be then distributed, again, to remove the burden on the suppliers to have to maintain in multiple portals. And that's, I think, the big failure of the portal and software is the presumption that, the ROI will be extracted of the value based on having the good data, which is very difficult to achieve, and based on the fact that suppliers are going to come to their portal to maintain, when in fact there's so many portals to maintain, you have a real portal fatigue. So I think that's a big key differentiator for our partnership is Jagger customers will have the benefit of having enhanced data and remove the burden on suppliers to be able to correct, validate, enhance that information and not having to do it in multiple places.
Yeah. And so looking broadly then at the kind of supplier data and broader just sort of data conversation then, and Jim sort of mentioned it earlier on in sort of in kind of his intro, was a sort of how this isn't necessarily a new problem. This isn't something that has just sort of happened overnight where people have suddenly realised they need better access to better information. They need to sort of understand it better and quicker and that sort of thing. And obviously the last, as we've said already, and again we'll touch on, but the last 12 months have kind of played a huge part in why and in what way we're talking about data and the kind of need for it. But it's a no-brainer. The benefits, as we talk right now, it's very clear as to why something like this needs to be, a partnership like this needs to happen and that sort of thing. But going back to, let's say, the start of last year in a pre-pandemic world, it seems such a long time ago now. I speak to a lot of people about sort of technology and procurement and where we were in terms of a maturity level on a broader scale. Like, what was the sort of conversation that people were having around this certain technology? Looking at data then and understanding data and analysing data and getting the most out of it. If you go back to, the start of 2020 or even before that, kind of where were we? Where was that conversation? What sort of levels of maturity were we seeing on a broad procurement perspective in terms of just how good we were and how much more efficient we were at handling and understanding data? And I'll ask you first, Stephany.
I mean, we successfully raised capital last year before COVID, so there was definitely some validation point that data was more critical, increasingly more critical, especially as the enterprise add more digital solutions and they're trying to get more efficiencies and capitalize on their investment in technology and the supply base. And we were seeing a lot of failures or friction in the digital transformation itself. And so all the trends were there, but when COVID happened, I think it just really highlighted that even though millions of dollars of investment had been poured in systems, that ultimately the speed and the access to that information to be able to respond to market changes and the demands of the business wasn't there. And so that's what we saw, supply chain in the headlines a year ago. If you talk supply chain data, but now everyone understand what that means because, it's been in the media. And to me, it's because it's failed, frankly. It may have had some plans in terms of recovery or, some contingency planning, but there's no solution to be able to react on it. Then it's just a plan. And we saw companies for the first 3 months, it was just really reacting to the crisis and ensuring that they're responding and accessing what they needed. It could have been as simple as just PPEs that, to keep their employees safe, but get them that they meet the requirements, get them ahead of everyone. And again, to talk about scale, we helped the UK government. They were the headlines. We heard a lot of empty planes coming back from different places or having PPEs that did not meet requirements. And so they were looking at a way to find manufacturers of PPE that had history and that were ISO certified outside of China. And through our partnership with Accenture at the time, we're able to get them onboarded within 72 hours, access to 60,000 manufacturers that had history of PPE, segmented by region, segmented by type of PPE, with the ISO certification to increase the level of trust with the contact information so that ultimately the government could react. And that's something that, sure, you could hire people to find the information, but at the speed and be able to access it in that time frame, that's possible because of the type of computing that exists in our heavy investment in machine learning for the past 4 years.
So, it's interesting when you look back at I guess it's been a year ago now. At this point, a year ago, everybody had this as a nice to have, not a have to have. And what was missing was the why, right? Yes, I know I need to do this, but why? And what it highlighted just in spades is the why, right? And so, I distinctly remember this time back in April of last year, we would have customers who had supplier catalogs with PPE equipment and so forth, but they were very specific to them, right? And all of a sudden they were gone and they were out of supply. And, we would literally get calls and say, hey, you guys have 5 million suppliers on your network. We need access to suppliers beyond the ones that we've already got contracted for. Who else can we go to, right? And so, I guess the good news is instantaneously, we're able to identify and open up the network to say, okay, well, we can't take shipments from these locations because they're either like literally that you can't get supply out of the regions, out of the ports, or as Stephany just said, right, I've got supplies that don't meet certain quality standards and aren't really an option anyway, so help me out. And so we were able to go in and literally, I remember getting calls from hospitals and governments at that time, going through. And what it defined is the why, right? Okay, now I understand. I'm connecting the dots. Do I really want to wait for the next why in order to put these pieces together? And so, where we're really starting to see a shift in the dynamic. And the same holds true, by the way, I think, to the supplier diversity as well. By definition, when you've got a diverse supplier base, you're going to get a mix of whether it's geographies or nationalities or what have you. And just like anything, right? The more diverse you are in terms of how you're supplying goods and services, the more you're going to reduce your overall risks.
So you've talked about the why then, and how perhaps the last year has kind of helped really identify the why it's needed. But when we think about where we are in terms of that kind of conversation and the advancements and sort of where we are today, obviously COVID itself presented its own particular set of challenges. But before then, what were some of the biggest challenges and the things that were kind of holding companies back from being further along that kind of supplier data conversation line? Like, what were sort of some of the common, we don't want to say missteps, but just things that were always seen as a challenge that many couldn't overcome? Jim, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can tell you exactly. I mean, I had a conversation with one of our suppliers a week or two ago, and we were just chit-chatting back and forth around some of the daunting tasks that they have to go through in order to do business, right? And I mentioned earlier, something that JAGGAER is very much trying to be aware of is how our network is impacting both buyers and suppliers and how they interact with one another. And the best analogy I can give is if we make the assumption that people are only going to use JAGGAER and that's it, right? We'd be able to lock it up and make a very seamless process for everybody. That's not the reality, right? Everybody's always going to have different organizations that they deal with. This particular supplier I was talking to, he said, he goes, in our case, we interact with 215 different, I'll call them portals of some sort, right? Updating catalogs and pricing and all sorts of different stuff. He's like, it's a daunting task. And so you talk about pre-COVID, what do they have to deal with? That's what they're dealing with. Everybody has sort of historically been very focused on that buyer community, but the buyer communities are highly dependent upon the supplier community to make their businesses efficient. And so, I think one of the areas where Stephany and team have done a really good job is identifying, how do I take that automate or that manual process and automate it as much as possible, so that I'm not updating it 210 times over. I'm updating it in one location once, and then disseminating that. And so it's important for organizations like JAGGAER to understand that we're a network of networks, so that we can make sure that we create that frictionless commerce market that we aspire to be.
I think we're moving into a fully integrated technology stack, right? So, and that's the same problem that I noticed when I built, previous to Tealbook, I had a consulting firm building procurement function. And I just saw, the biggest point of friction in the buy side is you just don't have access to the type of data you need fast enough. And spend data is important, but it's a fraction of the totality of the information you need to have. And even if you could synchronize all the information within the organization, you're still missing, you only know what you know about the suppliers. You're missing the whole external part of it and the intelligence behind it. And I remember asking a Fortune 100 client, like, by the time there's someone in the business that needs a supplier for whatever reason, what's the process that stakeholder will go through to get that supplier on board just to do their job? And the CPO spoke for about half an hour of all the things that they've put in place only for that information to land in the way that that employee could do their job. And that's just not acceptable anymore. Right. And I've been in more meetings now that it's not just procurement and supply chain. It's actually CFOs, CIOs, CEOs caring about this, because your competitiveness, your access to innovation, your risk mitigation dependent so highly on your supply base. And if you don't have information beyond your top line spend, like, you can't effectively use those levers to increase your EBITDA or make yourself more competitive. And that's a real challenge. And so, the ability for us to stay agnostic and use machine learning, we have a very strong data team and affiliation with the University of Toronto here, is focusing on the completeness of that information and over time, the accuracy. We have a mechanism now that can improve the data over time. As a world have known, yes, I can get good data, but it's a moment in time through a service for a specific requirement, and the next day the data decays and the suppliers have to upload. I've heard with small and diverse businesses up to 500 portals, and there's no upside benefit for them to update these portals. It doesn't make it smarter. It doesn't give them more visibility across the organization they're already working with. It doesn't understand the trends to put them in front of also similar customers where they could do really good work. It's all on them or on the buyers to be able to find them. And so if you can expedite that by having the information over time increasingly get better, so you can deliver more value to the buy side so that they can fully optimize the supply base, have more levers to drive their business, and then you're removing the burden on suppliers, you're really connecting the dots much faster, and you're enabling just business to just do business smarter.
And Stephany, you mentioned something that I'm always interested to hear a bit more about, is when you said like those conversations now aren't just happening where it's just a supply chain and procurement professional. There's the CFO, there's the CTO, the CEO, the CIO. Obviously, more people are involved. The wider business is kind of sitting down and having these conversations, becoming more engaged in those conversations in order to kind of make more sense of it and just ultimately run more efficiently and kind of make the right decisions. So looking then at obviously COVID and those sort of changed perspectives, how those conversations are happening now. Obviously, I guess it hasn't made those challenges go away entirely, but has that made it easier? Having more broader engagement from like a wider business, has that sort of made some of those challenges just a little easier to mitigate, a little easier to handle and to break down, because more people are engaged, more people involved, more of the business is kind of working together, as opposed to just traditionally supply chain and procurement's problem and then a CFO problem separately?
I mean, what from what we're hearing is the importance of some of those topics to the organization to survive or remain competitive or innovate. And I think having access to better information and having a really strong data foundation is really, really critical. And it's the enablement piece as well, allowing people in the organization to make faster, better decisions through automation, through having access to the information they need to drive their business forward. It's just raised. And then to what Jim talked about, COVID brought sort of, relocation of the supply chain, or having, supply chain in different countries you operate. So that adds a whole level of sourcing for those suppliers, maintaining records, right? Collecting information, driving more decisions. And then you've got topics like diversity, which a lot of companies now are coming out with these big commitments to improving their diversity spend. Well, in order to do that, you need to have access to data, and not having data at scale on small, diverse suppliers that you do business with, because often you just can't necessarily access those small suppliers, but you should be able to tap into that knowledge that you're spending $100 with a supplier, millions of dollars. You need to have that information at scale. I think all the topics are leading now that the executive team and board members are asking about ESG requirements and diversity, are topics that are actually being, asked by investors, by board members. So it's not even necessarily within the organization, but they need to comply. They need to set standards, and they need to be able to track progress. And you can't do it if you don't have a culture that's driven by insight and data. And if you only rely on software to do that, but combining the two is where the magic happens, because there's a lot of other things that you need through software to automate and build workflow and allow people to be able to function.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could add one piece to that. So, having done this for a long time, this year was the first year that I've actually seen what I'd call SWAT teams put together, like executive level SWAT teams being put together that says, okay, we got a supply chain risk. What are we going to do? Right. And you literally have COO, CFO, CPO from organizations at the table at the same time. And what they're wanting to know is, okay, we can't source from these different locations. And, we've, over the course of the last year, been able to work with a partner with organizations and internal resources to be able to say, okay, you've got these level of goods and services coming from this location, and it to collectively forms a bill of materials that's required in order to produce a product, right? And if you have all that level of detail, you can then go back to them and say, okay, here are the ramifications of that. Not only from a revenue perspective, which they all care about, but from a broader overall global health perspective, right? If I can't physically assemble PPE in a manner that I need to get it out the door, not only is it going to hurt me from a revenue perspective, but it's going to impact employees and people all over the globe. It's the first time that I've seen that where at a broader executive level in the organization, people have coming together and going, okay, this has got a material impact not only on our business but on how we work today. And by the way, I mean we're working with those organizations right now. I mean, all of these the pharmaceutical companies, they got to think about the logistics of sourcing and identifying suppliers for how they get vaccine distributions out to billions of people all over the globe, right? All that stuff needs to be, you got to have suppliers to do every one of those to the last mile.
And this is a somewhat kind of impossible question because I know we don't really know what's going to happen and that sort of thing. But you've talked about there. I enjoyed that expression, that kind of first time ever you'd seen it. Essentially, what was a SWAT team of internal kind of stakeholders. But whatever the future is going to look like, and whatever we look like when we come out of the pandemic, and I always ask this question, and I get a really interesting sort of selection of answers. But do you think there's going to be a kind of any backward steps? So risk, for example, is shot right up in terms of priorities now, and supplier risk, and that should have been number one or at least number two, but once upon a time might not have been in the top 10, but now it is kind of a key priority. Do you think that when we come out of this, and whatever the kind of a sense of normality is anymore, that we will start seeing backward steps, or is this kind of progressed the conversation further to a point where this is the only way we can do things now, because why would we ever go back? Again, I know it's a bit of an impossible question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'll ask you first, Stephany.
Well, I had a slide on a deck that said who, and I'm sure that's been distributed too, but who's driven your digital transformation, the CFO, the CEO, or COVID? And I think it's more true than ever that COVID's driven, I should say accelerated the digital transformation. I think when you have time in a digital transformation to put the plan together and discuss the plan and decide on the roadmap, but this really accelerated the speed and also looking for solutions to be able to do this faster, easier, drive better change, have better outcome. And so I think we swung really far on the risk side. I think there's going to be a place where it's going to recalibrate somewhat in the future, but having visibility, having access to your suppliers and the suppliers that you don't know about, that you should know about. And to me, that also is an element of mitigating your risk, because if you have full visibility across the entire supplier base, that's where you can see where risk happens. And risk happens usually not in your top suppliers. It happens in your tail end. It happens with your suppliers. And so having that visibility is so critical in today's market that I don't see that going backwards. I think this is incredibly exciting actually for the function and for the industry.
Yeah, so I'll give you an analogy. Unfortunately, I've been doing this for a long time. I've got it probably shows in my age here, but early in my career, I spent a lot of time in healthcare. And in healthcare, I remember distinctly there was a point in time where you were trying to convince people that, hey, it's a good idea to have electronic medical records, right? And at the time, it was like, hey, this paper works, it's not broken, don't really need it. Fast forward 30 years, the thought of someone actually going back to paper to do that type of work is crazy, right? And I think what you're gonna see is a similar process here, right? Now that okay, been a forcing mechanism to expose while the other system, it worked, it wasn't the best, but what it did is exposed all your vulnerabilities, and I will be surprised if it actually goes backwards, because I think that people are seeing the efficiencies out of what's out there and available, and unfortunately, I think that it just took a bit of an anomaly to expose it.
And sort of a similar kind of similar sort of thought process here. Then, final question for you, and it's another one that I like to ask because the last year has been challenging for businesses in so many different ways, and one of the things that I'm always curious to hear is like you say, regardless of whether you've been in the game for 30 years, whether you've been in it for a couple of years or the last 10 years, you have a way of working, you have a way of understanding and approaching a challenge, and what you think is best for procurement, while not necessarily is a guarantee of success, it's just something that's worked for you, and you always kind of adopt that mentality. But the last year has caused a lot of reflection and has forced a lot of people to rethink and approach things in a very different way. So personally speaking then, and I'll start with you, Stephany, what's kind of, over the last 12 months, what's one sort of change you've kind of had to make in terms of the way you just approach, the kind of day-to-day sort of procurement challenges that you've have to face, or the data challenges, in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have thought if the pandemic hadn't have happened, if that makes sense? Like, what sort of one kind of surprising change you've sort of found yourself having to do?
I mean, for us, it's been all positive, right? So the awareness and the criticality of having access to good data is now a top priority. So definitely we've benefited from that. I think we always also want partnerships. So it was always we made a commitment early on that we're not going to build software to compete with the e-procurement market. We were going to really focus on developing or delivering the best data so we could power it. And so I think what surprises just the speed as what the partnership, the acceleration, I think, of the need came from customers, and then partners like JAGGAER reaching out to find better ways to solve a problem that their customers were facing. And so, happily surprised that accelerated, and it allows us to have more partnership. That means better data for everyone. That means easier for suppliers to engage or to be able to maintain their profile, more autonomous way of doing things. And so I think it's all been really positive on my side. And I'm saying this delicately because it's not, COVID's been quite difficult and challenging for a lot of businesses. So I feel definitely incredibly grateful.
I will say this, what it has made the biggest impact of what we actually have sort of changed day to day of what we do is, again, the sense of urgency of how critical these systems become has been paramount. The net result of that is you have more people within an organization who are actually using the applications. And that's got a ripple effect, right? Because in doing so, enterprise applications today, people are expecting them to work like consumer applications, right? They're expecting them to work like, what they use on the weekends, whether it's Instagram or any of those sort of social media type of applications. They're not expecting directions. They don't want directions. They want to be able to speak to these applications in a natural language processing way, rather than going to hunt and peck. And so what we're seeing is a broader spectrum of people using and interacting with our applications, which necessitates on our part to be able to be easy to use, easy to work with, and really focused on customer success. And so, we have sort of, not that it wasn't important before, but it's just emphasizing the opportunity to cater to a broader group of people, I think, than what we've historically have done, because you have lots of people throughout an organization now. I mean, think about it. We have, higher education is one of our big markets, and literally over a weekend, you had to go in and say, okay, you can't ship to, this faculty buildings anymore. You need to ship to home. How do you do that, right? And overnight, all of a sudden, you have to change policies and procedures throughout the entire organization, and that's got to be something easy to do.
And I know I said that was my final question, but sort of final question. Want to sort of end on a nice, not that wasn't a positive note, but kind of on a very sort of hopeful note. There's no secret to success. One person's sort of way of doing things isn't going to be the same for everyone else's, but obviously, it's, like you say, we've been grateful, and in what has been a difficult time, to be able to find ourselves in a very great position, and sort of, come out of it looking very prosperous and sort of in a position where the future is going to hopefully the only ways up. What's kind of one sort of piece of advice or kind of thought process that, I know I just asked what's changed, but kind of that you would give to somebody who sort of, like, kind of what would be a secret to success, as it were? Like, what kind of key mantra or key advice would you sort of give or follow in trying to kind of, not guarantee success, but just sort of steering the course and staying true, going along the right lines to succeeding in any way, shape or form? Waffly question again, but I hope that makes sense. But Stephany, what would you sort of think?
My very biased opinion is that you should have a data strategy. That you should question. If you're a CFO and you're about to sign a multi-million-dollar software deal, you should ask question about the data piece of it. How is it going to be collected? How is it going to be maintained? What coverage you're going to have? How much dependency on suppliers to come to the portal? How long is that going to take? And if there's any way that you can automate that, it's going to significantly improve your investment in technology. And you should have the flexibility to choose a technology that best fit your needs in the organization. And we're very proud to partner with JAGGAER. We feel this is a really best-in-class technology, and that elevates also our profile as a data partner to our customers. We should have that flexibility because the data will stay constant. The data is a need that's going to continuously drive a lot more insight and enablement across the organization through applications like JAGGAER's. And you just need good data. And so ask good questions. And if you don't like the answer, then look for solutions.
Yeah, and so I would agree with Stephany. I'll pull that thread just a little bit more, right? So a data strategy, and then something that I know my team probably gets tired of hearing me is the why, right? Why have the data strategy? Why pull these systems together? And where we, to go back to a point that I made earlier, these SWAT teams that evolved really highlighted the why. And so I think if you when people are looking at implementing these strategies, when they really digged into the why are we doing this, it creates the accountability within their own organizations to make sure that they pull it all the way through to the end. It's one thing to start putting a system like this in place, isn't quite something else to make sure that it's ubiquitous throughout the organization. And so I would strongly encourage folks to continually ask the why.